I'd like to welcome all of you and get started with our program. But first, I'd like to start with just a little bit of history. The Farber in Dana-Farber is Sidney Farber, who, as those of you who read Emperor of All Maladies know, is considered to be a founding father of modern cancer research. His pioneering work in childhood cancers has become the foundation of much cancer research and treatment. The institution that bears his name was known as the New England Medical Center in his time. One of Dana-Farber's colleagues was a renowned hematologist, William Damschek, known by his colleagues as the Boss, who convened the first meeting of hematologists, which would become the American Society of Hematology, what we know as ASH, and founded its professional journal, Blood. When his students were asked, "Where did you train?" no medical institution had the prominence to compete with the answer with Damschek. One of Dr. Damschek's most prominent students was Dr. Robert Kyle of the Mayo Clinic, and if there was a family tree of myeloma researchers and clinicians, every line would lead to Dr. Kyle. One of those direct lines would lead to Dr. Kenneth Anderson, the program director of Dana-Farber's Jerome Lipper Multiple Myeloma Center, and LeBeau, who in past 4 decades has been a seminal leader in developing many of the concepts in myeloma we take for granted, like the tumor microenvironment, immunology, translational research, genomics, just to list a few. And under his leadership, Dana-Farber's myeloma program has been of the brightest beacons in the field. Now, as you can see, the lineage of today's speakers has deep roots in hematology and myeloma, so we hope this discussion will provide further insights about why it's important to connect with a specialist wherever you live. There are many strong myeloma centers in the world of excellence, and with today's program, we're not saying Dana-Farber is the best or better than others, but we want to give you a glimpse into how an excellent, outstanding myeloma program works. So I will like to address the first question to our nurses, but each of you please feel free to add your insights to all our questions. So first of all, can you explain the differing nursing roles in your clinic and how you interact with patients? And what do patient navigators do, and how do they interact with physicians, nurses, and administrators? Sorry, that was a very long intro, but I'm very thrilled. The work that your institution does is just so outstanding. I'm just continually impressed by it. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Kathleen, I think you need to unmute.
I can start with our group. Nursing is a very strong component of the myeloma group. Paul's nodding his head. It's very diverse. We have nurse practitioners. I believe there's 8 nurse practitioners in our group. We have 6 research nurses. We have oncology nurse navigators. We also have the infusion room nurses that actually administer the chemotherapy or the therapy. And we all work together. We work closely with the physicians, closely with the patients and their families. And it's a very cohesive group of practitioners that take care of the patients.
Yeah, I agree with that, Eileen. I think that the role of the nurse navigator or the clinical research nurse is really important more than ever because so many treatment advances in multiple myeloma. And I think we really do play a key role in educating patients. With so many treatments emerging, especially in combination therapies, this is extremely overwhelming for patients. And I see that our role, obviously in education, but helping patients navigate through very complex treatment schedules. Many of our therapies today are, administered as an IV infusion, oral therapy, subcutaneous therapies, and then again, all of this is in combination. So, as the research nurse or nurse navigator, helping the patient, try to, weed through when I take what is. So what we provide these patients is with calendars, and you go over them, in detail, and telling patients how to take their medications. Obviously, going into clinic, educating the patients on each of the diseases, the myeloma disease, about the drugs, the known side effects, and obviously talking to patients about supportive medication measures, which are, I think it's all key part of the education as the nurse navigator or clinical research nurse. And obviously we work very closely, with our colleagues, nurse practitioners and physicians.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so critical that your whole entire staff work as a team and is so supportive. because I just know through my treatment, I had so many questions for my nurse,
Mhm.
and my doctor was wonderful, but very busy, right? As you all are.
Mhm.
The whole team is busy, but that day-to-day question and answer is just so critical for patients and makes all the difference in the world. And I see the doctors nodding their heads.
Right. Right.
um,
That's
so,
one of the things that we try to, when we meet with patients and their families, is just to let them know how to get a hold of us and what we can do for them. It's very, as Kathy said, it's very overwhelming, especially at first when people are first starting out on therapy.
mhm,
And it's really important that they have a contact person that they know they can call and they can reach and that can take care of whatever it is they need.
mhm.
And oftentimes we get calls that aren't nursing related, but we know where to send them. So it's really important that the patients feel that they have a voice that will listen to them when they need help.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for all you do for patients every single day. I say that all the time. Dr. Richardson, you had a comment?
Well, I was just going to echo how nicely you framed it, Jen, because I think we're in, and I would love Jacob to comment more. We're incredibly proud and appreciative of our nursing team. I personally think they're second to none. The joke in the team is that we're nurse strong and a bit doc thin, which I take as a compliment. Anyway, but at the same time, no, it's really true. I mean, I think that philosophically, you so kindly said Kathy retired in January. Well, Kathy and I have worked together since 1994, and we were, needless to say, heartbroken when she chose to hang up her shingle, as it were. But it's lovely to see her this morning, and it's such a privilege to work with Eileen, and we work together very cohesively, as Eileen so nicely said, because this really is an incredibly multifaceted disease that, in its complexity, challenges everything from our standpoint as physicians, medically, in terms of the pathobiology of the illness and all its manifestations, but the emotional and spiritual consequences of the illness are protean. And it therefore takes a really multidisciplinary approach. And it's funny, Jenny, I was just on the email actually with one of our medical social workers, Larissa, just now, to sort of bring into you that idea of how a truly multidisciplinary team engages all aspects of patient care. And in clinical research, which we kind of consider synonymous with best care, best clinical research, best care, the two dovetail, they're not separate. And I think the reality of the nursing team in that process is so central to its success. And then, I wouldn't even know where to start to tell you the kind of impact the research nursing group, for example, has made on optimizing our therapies. And I think of that in many different ways, but an obvious example is the management of peripheral neuropathy with bortezomib. That's a highly nuanced and skilled approach. And it's no accident that at Dana-Farber, we have some of the best outcomes in terms of symptom management in regards to specific tolerability issues with our drugs. And bedside observation to us has been an absolutely primary focus of what we do in order to improve outcome.
Yeah, thank you. It kind of leads us to our second question. So, what distinguishes a myeloma specialist from a community oncologist, and what kinds of services can a clinic like yours provide that are not as prevalent at general oncology facilities? Because what I see in the team management and the teamwork of that program is it's solely myeloma focused. And in my opinion, myeloma is very nuanced and very a challenge to treat and to stay up on, and it's recurrent, so you are never really done. You keep going, and it's kind of a long-term commitment that you're making. So do you want to speak to the need for a myeloma specialist, because we advocate for that all the time?
It would be lovely if Jacob could comment. Jacob?
Sure, I can speak to that. I think what distinguishes a myeloma specialty program, Jennifer, is very much in line with what you mentioned. At a place like Dana-Farber, the care that we provide across cancers is very subspecialized, and people have typically made a decision as they've progressed through their nursing training or their medical training as physicians to really devote and dedicate their professional experience to treatment of patients with either a single disease or diseases that fall in the same family. And in the case of multiple myeloma, these are diseases that all relate to disorder of plasma cell biology. And there's a relatively small number of them, but as Paul and Eileen and Kathy pointed out, this is a very, very complex disease with many different faces to it. And I think the experience that one develops in treating patients day after day after day is really quite enormous. And the other aspect of that was, touched upon in regard to the previous question, in that we have a large team comprised of essentially 10 physicians, 8 nurse practitioners, 5 oncology nurse navigators, and then a very large team on the research side as well, which I'm sure we'll touch on at a later point. Not to mention the staff within the infusion room suite, where those nurses as well are really kind of focused in particular areas. And I think this disease really requires that level of expertise on the one hand, and then very close collaboration on the other hand with our colleagues in the community. And I think all of us, on the MD side and on the nursing side, really enjoy the collaborations that we develop over the years with our colleagues in the community. So both are essential. I think, for patients who are getting care in the community, they can receive absolutely fabulous care, but there's a tremendous value add to having a myeloma specialist involved. And for us, we recognize how important the communication back and forth with the community provider is.
Mm-hmm. And not everyone can travel, and I understand that, but I know a lot of facilities, especially during COVID, have opened up to telehealth types of visits, especially for second opinions, which will be part of my next question. But in terms of nursing, Kathy and Eileen, do you have any thoughts about working in general oncology versus myeloma specialty oncology as well?
Well, at Dana-Farber, it's very specialized. But I think in myeloma, and I've been working in myeloma since 2014, I've, had to rely on all my years of nursing and nurse practitioner experience in caring for these patients. They have orthopedic problems, cardiology problems, and we're very fortunate in that we work closely with the specialists at Brigham and Women's Hospital that are very familiar with our patients, so that when we refer them for help, it's somebody that knows myeloma and knows us and can deal with the patients. But I think myeloma is very specialized, and everybody that practices in our group, that's what we do, but we do a whole lot more than that.
Mm-hmm. Kathy, I think you might be muted.
Can't hear you, Kathy.
No, now you're muted. Yeah, while she's working on that, there's data from the Mayo Clinic that shows, and it broke patients into tiers of the facilities of the number of patients that a particular facility treats in quartiles, like from 5 to 10 or 10 to 25 or on up. And that data showed that there's at least, at a minimum, a 2-year survival improvement if you see a myeloma specialist. Now, the University of North Carolina did a follow-up study as well, and they showed that you live 39% longer if you are treated by a myeloma specialist. So maybe not going back and forth over, for your care, but I know a lot of patients have to do that, right? They'll consult with you as a myeloma specialist or a myeloma specialist team. They'll go back to their local oncology center and get local care, and that's a partnership that works as well. But the data does show that it does matter that if you have a myeloma specialist on your team. And with so many new treatment options available, which is a great problem to have, it can be really a lot more confusing. So I hope, and I know that my facility did this for me, that patients are able to ask the nursing staff questions like, well, tell me a little bit more about this treatment or this treatment. So then when they have the clinician visit, it's a much smoother conversation than where do I start? I mean, there are so many treatment combinations that you can consider right now as a myeloma patient that it's hard to make decisions like that right now.
It's so true. And I think, Jennifer, in line with that, I think one of the terms that we use a lot is sequencing of therapy. How do you properly sequence treatments? And I think that's something that as specialists, we give a lot of thought to. Our program with Omar Nadim's leadership has kind of vaulted into the space of pathways, which really has given our team as a whole an opportunity to think about that in a very strategic and systematic way, which we then share with our colleagues in the community as well. So many factors play into the sequencing of agents or regimens used in this disease, and I think it's crucially important.
Yeah,
I so agree with Jacob, Jen. I think that we're blessed now where we can think strategically about myeloma and not tactically. And it becomes very important because what we're learning is that certain therapies can result in certain selection pressures in terms of clonality of disease, and particularly also in the context of whole genome mutational burden. And this has a major impact on long-term outcome, we think. So this is becoming very, very important. And I absolutely echo Jacob's point about pathways. And in that same context, our research is geared to that as well. I think it's incredibly important for patients to appreciate that the so-called standard of care in myeloma is changing all the time. And that's an incredibly good thing because obviously from being an incurable hematologic malignancy now, we're seeing an increasingly large proportion of patients enjoy disease control over many years. And so this construct of sequencing is so important because one can then lead to another, and how we interplay the role of research in that becomes critical because, traditionally in the oncological model, Jen, research is kind of kept for the last innings. That, to my mind, is absolutely wrong. We need to make sure it's integrated into the structure so that if a research strategy fails a patient, there's then a fallback position, and vice versa, of course. And most importantly, a lot of our research now, Jen, involves combinations of approved treatments. How do you best put them together and how do you sequence them? So research and sequencing become part of the same sort of equation. And I think Jacob nailed it, that there are these opportunities in pathways that we've built with Omar's leadership, but also in our research algorithm, we think of smoldering, newly diagnosed, early relapse, late relapse, early phase, late phase. And we've also learned another important lesson, Jen, that in that context, there's a lovely old saying, less haste, more speed. A lot of the trials are being built to move very quickly. And we've kind of hopefully engendered some degree of caution into that model because sometimes if you move too quickly from an early phase study into phase 3, you can actually set yourself up for failure. And so there's a nuance to this approach, which is terribly important to appreciate.
Mm-hmm. And clinical trials is a complex, scenario. So you run a lot of clinical trials. We're going to talk about that because it's a really important topic. Yes, I agree. And Kathleen, my next question is for everyone. So you may need to rejoin if your audio is not working.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. Okay, so let me ask this to everyone. What should new patients expect when they come to your clinic? And are there differences in approaches between a newly diagnosed patient who starts at Dana-Farber and one that comes for a second opinion or is referred after being treated somewhere else? And does that differ from other facilities?
I don't know if that's for the physicians, but we know that it's very important that newly diagnosed patients, have complete workups, especially. So I think it's very important for us to see the newly diagnosed patients. I would say more for the physicians to determine disease burden, involvement, to making sure when a bone marrow biopsy is done, it's sent for FISH and for cytogenetics. It's very important to determine, staging. Does a patient have high risk or low risk disease? Determining prognosis, and obviously, looking at what is the dynamics of the treatment. Is it single agent, double, triplets, and for the newly diagnosed patients? So, bone marrow biopsies, imaging is very important. Appropriate blood work, The fish, as I said, the immunoglobulins, light chains, making sure patients get PETs or CT scans, whichever appropriate.
I think that idea of thorough testing differs because when patients go to general oncology clinics, well, this happened to me. Anyway, and I know I've talked to many patients that this happened to. Without doing a bone marrow biopsy, they said, "We think you have myeloma and we'll start you on treatment on Friday." I was like, "You think I have myeloma? You probably need to do all the right tests, right? What kind of myeloma do I have? Is there a difference between kinds of myeloma?" So when you talk about, Kathy, workup, that proper workup, especially for a newly diagnosed patient, it seems like it would be really, really important. Anybody else want to weigh in on that idea?
I think as we see patients, either new or relapsed patients, it's really important that they bring with them a good history of previous treatments. Often Paul and Jacob can attest to this. Often the information that we get is not real accurate, or it's kind of sketchy. So it's really important that the patient understand what they've had before and why they're seeing us and what we can hope to accomplish with the visit or with the consult.
Mm-hmm. And doctors?
I think that in addition to what Kathy and Eileen have mentioned, which is obviously really crucial, counting on us having, with the patient's input, a really thorough understanding of the patient's myeloma history up to that point, whether they're newly diagnosed or they've been dealing with the disease for several years and have been through different lines of treatment. That's really, really important. And to Kathy's point, ensuring that all the appropriate diagnostic studies that are going to allow us to understand the biological facets of the disease and also the way that we're going to monitor the condition over time are key. Two other things that I would just point out that I find really important for that first visit is just the time that we take to get to know the patient, to find out about not only their medical background, but also about who they are as a person. What their family history is important, but also what is this person's history? What makes them tick? I always, I enjoy asking people what their interests are, what's important to them. And that really gives me a sense of what their priorities are, what things give them joy and satisfaction, happiness, love in their life. I find that, very important. The second is to ensure that in that first meeting, that the patient understands multiple myeloma. I typically will take some time, particularly if it's somebody who's newly diagnosed, to just explain what this disease is, because while myeloma is rather prevalent at around 33,000 new diagnoses in the United States per year, it's still not as common as many of the other cancers that are treated at our center, like colorectal cancer, prostate, et cetera. And I think it's really important for patients to have a grounding in how the disease originates, how it can affect them clinically, and how we try to prevent the different manifestations of the disease from occurring through the treatments that are offered.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's beautifully said by Jacob, and I echo Eileen's comments and Kathy's before. I think a couple of things to add to. I think Eileen makes a very good point about background information, because at the best, to my mind, when I meet my patients for the first time, the best dialogue is directly with the patient and their knowledge of their events and their loved ones with them, to ensure that we have a whole picture. Because you won't be surprised, Jen, that the sort of printouts we get from outside centers can, by the time we get to what matters, you're lost from the wood from the trees. So I do agree with that completely. And I love the comment Jacob made about getting to know our patient. And I get into trouble with my administration, but I take a lot of time, up to an hour and a half, 2 hours with my patients, depending on how much we can manage in the time we have. But I think that's critical, because at the end of the day, it's all about the whole of the person. And Jacob's absolutely right about what goals are and needs. And this is, I think, one of the greatest things to have been part of over the last 20 to 30 years of myeloma therapeutics is to now have treatment options that can be tailored to the patient's needs. And a mother who wants to have that amount of uninterrupted time with her children until she is in a position to take next steps wants a continuous therapy, perhaps that's much less intensive, orally based, periodic visits, that kind of thing, versus someone who says, I really want to take this on head on and deal with it up front now as aggressively as I possibly can. And understanding all of that is so important. I think the sort of gorilla in the room, Jen, for newly diagnosed patients right now in the last year and a half has been the impact of COVID. And I think understanding how that is impacting how we deliver care has been huge. And I think at Dana-Farber, I wanted to stress how I feel, particularly in the way Jacob, Eileen, Kathy, and I work, which is Yorkie 7, how incredible the response to that challenge has been. And I think you touched on it by saying the advent of telemedicine. And I think I would build on that and say that beyond just telemedicine has been the way as a unit we've responded to this challenge. And I want to especially acknowledge our nursing team, actually, because the Y7 nursing team, to my mind, has been phenomenal in how we've engaged in that process. And at the same time, on the clinic side, with our clinical leadership, we've been able, and that means everybody in the clinic, we've been able to really make the new patient experience still very cohesive, very seamless, and to Jacob's point, extremely informative, so that people get all the information they need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanna put in a little plug here, because this really helped as I was I was getting second opinions over the last year and a half on what I should do for my treatment. And it was very helpful to have put every single thing about my care, my prior history, my genetics, all my labs from 10 years into a single place in the HealthTree Cure Hub. So when we did a telemedicine visit with my doctors, we actually just used HealthTree, because I don't know if patients know this, but your records are getting sent over. When you get a second opinion, they might have 800 pages coming off the fax machine as they're trying to see you, just because of when your old facility sent the information. I mean, the timing is hard for everyone to coordinate, right? You want to have the records before, and there's a team that goes through the records and spends hours going through the records so the clinician can see you as a patient. But you can help with that. You can pull all that stuff together, and we have a team on the back end that if you share your consent, that they'll go get it for you. They'll put it in a single place, so you'll have that history, and you can go get a second opinion very easily using that tool. Then like, what kind of myeloma do I have? Some patients don't know what kind, if it's alpha or lambda. Some patients don't know if it's IgG or IgM, or they don't know anything about their genetics. I would say maybe 30% of patients understand their genetics of their disease and don't know how to read their FISH test. So we can help do some of that on the back end. So when you get a second opinion like this, you can be prepared. And I like what you said also about the goals. So I was diagnosed at 43, and my treatment goal was cure me, hit me as hard as possible, and get me as long a remission as possible. But somebody who's diagnosed at 80 or 85 might just say, I want good quality of life so I can spend time with my grandkids. So what you're saying is really, really important. Everything is personalized.
Right. I think there's a silver lining too with COVID, is that the patients now do have the availability of doing telemedicine, whereas before they were unable to travel. So for multiple reasons, they maybe didn't have the resources, they had families, they were working, and now patients and their families have the opportunity to speak with a myeloma specialist and over the phone and get that opinion, and are they on the right track with their therapy. So I think that is just so very important. And then having with HealthTree a place where they can put all of their most pertinent information instead of going through, as we see, the 800 pages coming through a fax machine. So, and this is the greatest opportunity for patients out there to be able to think about and access the idea of getting a telemedicine consult with a specialist to make sure that you're on the right track with your therapy, dependent upon obviously your isotope of your disease, the burden of your disease, etc. So it's good.
Yeah, we actually built a telehealth portal inside of HealthTree that we haven't launched yet, but it does work. And it's really
That's great.
great.
I,
um,
I
let's
would add, Jen. I would add, Jen, one thing though about telemedicine. I think, and I'd love Jacob's perspective on this as well. I think for established patients who you know well and you have that relationship, it's fantastic because they don't have to jump on a plane in for Alabama, fly through Atlanta, and come to Boston. But the relationship that you already have is the catalyst to the ability to do that. I think for new patients, it's such a challenge, and it's one of my patients who I did see initially by telemedicine, and then she came to see me in person. She said how glad she was she'd done the in person because she said it was so much better and it really helped. And even though she really appreciated the time in the telemedicine visit, it doesn't replace that establishment of rapport that you build by being in person. Jacob, I'd love your comments on that.
Dr. Laubach, but do you want to comment on that too?
Sure. I mean, I certainly see some of the progress and the advantages that we've seen over the last year in terms of the use of telemedicine. But it is true. There's nothing like having that in-person exchange. So as we see some glimmer of light with COVID and the success of the vaccines, recognizing we're still not in an easy place, I think we'll find the right balance. I know other centers are dealing with the same thing. Dana-Farber certainly has been, and I have to say that on the whole, as Paul said, I think that the leadership, the clinical leadership, has done a really fantastic job in terms of just keeping the access to care, the access to specialty care at Dana-Farber there throughout this really trying 16, 17, 18 month period.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a question about second opinions too? Because in myeloma, I mean, I've had multiple consults, not just two, for what I'm going to do next, because I feel like I'm playing chess with my life and I don't want to go and make a wrong move. As sometimes patients feel like they're burning bridges if they go get a second opinion. I do not see anything wrong with getting a second opinion or even a third opinion because the perspectives are different. And in the suggestions that were made to me, I got lots of differing opinions, even from top myeloma experts. So then I kind of have to think about my personal strategy and my goals and say, well, this one kind of most closely aligns, and all the opinions were great. So as a patient considers that, I think patients want to know, how do I not offend my doctor by going to get a second opinion from potentially a myeloma specialist or even a second myeloma specialist?
Paul, do you want to comment on that?
And please, Jacob, you too immediately afterwards, because I think honestly, if your doctor's concerned about you getting a second opinion, it's time to get a second opinion. See what I mean? I welcome as much input, because you nailed it, Jennifer. It is the Queen's Gambit. It's a chess game. And the more heads that you bring to the table, the better. The important thing is also to realize, though, that I do understand your point, Jen, that you don't want, you don't want sort of too many leadership inputs and not enough execution on the ground. That obviously is the opposite of that. But I honestly believe that in our world, we're very comfortable with sharing and working together. And an analogy I use with my patients is, you've kind of got, and excuse the term, you've got your Tom Brady or whoever that may be, and we kind of want to be Bill Belichick. Now, I know it's a bit dated now, given the moves in the football world, but having said that, that's kind of how I love to think about it. So we're kind of your coach, if you will, and you've got your local quarterback. Jacob, I'd love you to sort of build on that, but that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, I feel the same. Certainly, the other thing to say is that the myeloma community nationally and even internationally is a fairly close-knit group. We all know each other. And I think over time, we develop relationships both on the research side and on the clinical side. I mean, I know Paul, for example, sees at least one new patient from New York City every week. who's been followed by a myeloma expert in New York. And, a tough question has come up, and they come up and see Paul or a member of our team. And I think you get a fresh perspective when you see a new provider sometimes who takes sort of a 10,000-foot view for the first time and may see something subtle about the patient's treatment history that gives a new perspective or a new inroad. And I think that doctors or patients, I should say, can certainly count on the fact that we as physicians have a lot of respect for one another, and there's a real collegiality in terms of the way that we interact with one another. I think from my perspective as a physician, one challenging area can be if a patient decides to switch providers. That can be a little bit challenging at times. And I have always advised my patients, if they're thinking about making a change in provider, to have communication with the provider that they're leaving. Because I think that those open lines of communication are very helpful and help all of us learn and grow from our experiences.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jacob. And I think the piece that's actually touches on a critical point, Jen. This is truly, we're using a lot of metaphors, but I hope they're helpful. I consider myeloma a marathon. It's not a sprint. And there are many factors that contribute to partnership with caregivers that may change over time. And I think that it's not just scientific, it's not just purely clinical, it's deeply emotional and spiritual. And not everyone has that chemistry, or it may change at times. And so I completely agree with Jacob that I think if there is an uneasiness in a relationship, the more quickly it's sort of discussed and addressed, the better for everyone. And I think it goes from there. I think one thing I've realized very much in my practice is the importance of time. Now, that's a bit of a standing joke because I tend to run way behind time. But the fact of the matter is that you just got to give patients the time they need. And I'll do all I can to do that. That's not so easy, actually, these days, particularly as medicine as a field is trying to push us in the opposite direction. And I think in myeloma, we try to resist that, and I say that in the best sense, i.e. being very personal, because above all, it's a deeply humanistic relationship in my view, and that is what comes first. And I think just to pivot it back a bit, that's where our nursing team becomes absolutely vital, because that's the piece that matters. And I think it brings that dimension where we as a team don't bear it all on one set of shoulders, we spread it. And deeply personal relationships develop. I mean, I can't tell you how many of my patients have said how much they're missing Kathy, and how much actually my nurse practitioner, Mary, also moved into a different role, sort of, dare I say it, semi-retiring, and perhaps that's the right word. But in any event, everyone's saying, and we'd worked together since 1996, if that gives you an idea of sort of timelines. The point is that they each have and every one have said how much they miss, and thank God for Eileen. Anyway, putting that all to one side, those are the kinds of relationships that you build, and I think that myeloma is very difficult, and it's a disease that's so
Complex.
Well, complex is the word, and I would say what's so subtle about it, you've got it just right, Jennifer. It's a chess game, but it's a chess game where the stakes are very high. And things can change very quickly. So I think as a result, and they can wax and wane, that sort of clonal tiding is so strange, isn't it? You know, things are quiet for a while, and then suddenly things change. So to build that for a physician-patient relationship becomes, I think, one of the joys of the work, actually, is when those relationships work well. Obviously, one of the challenges is when they get a bit bumpier. But having said that, I would say, and I speak for us as a team, I think in our group, we work very hard to make that work as well as we can for every patient we see.
Mm-hmm. And Eileen and Kathy, we have tried to, but this is why we built HealthTree University, because of the clinic time challenge, because you're being asked, all of you are being asked to do more with less time and see more patients. And it's not really fair for you because you want to spend the time with the patient answering their question. So that's why we said, like, why are you, we don't want you spending 20 minutes asking your doctor what's a monoclonal protein. Go learn that at home on HealthTree University, and also ask the nursing staff. So how, Eileen and Kathy, are you happy to help try to do some of that education so that when you're in the clinic visit, you say, Like, what are we dealing with right now? What's my myeloma doing? What kind of side effects am I having? And we're focused really on those types of really personal issues rather than more broad kind of.
Absolutely. We encourage our patients to ask us these questions. And unfortunately, we also have time restraints too, but we tend to, if somebody needs your time, you give it to them, regardless of how many more patients you have to see that day. And as Paul said, we often get in trouble for this, but it's a very difficult disease to understand. A lot of patients have had myeloma for many years and still really don't understand what their SPEP means, or what it means when their M spike rises or their kappa light chains are go up. And we often spend a lot of time education's a big part of nursing. It's one of the many hats that nurses wear, is to educate our patients, and we do our best. We try to, and oftentimes it flows over into the infusion unit or a phone call afterwards, after the visit, to try to help the patient understand. But it is a big part of our role, and we do our best.
Yeah, I mean, I think as clinical research nurses, nurse navigators, are the nurse practitioners, we certainly, I mean, educating and advocating for our patients, and helping with supportive care. But I think we try to maybe simplify it a little bit so that the patient's more of an understanding language for the patients, to say why they'll always say, why am I going on to this therapy, and why was this chosen, and explaining to the patient that the target of that therapy, but in a manner that they're going to understand. Our communication with our patient is key. We build, big, long personal relationships with our patients, and they rely on us, to kind of, talk them down when they're upset, and, not understanding the complexity of, why is my therapy now oral? Maybe IV should be better, or, all the, the new monoclonal antibodies, the CAR T therapies. So, talking to patients about different treatment modalities, the side effects, supportive care. And that's the best part of it. I love my job for that, just because I loved educating the patients and taking the time with them, because they're scared. And, whether they're newly diagnosed or their disease is relapsing, and they're just thinking what's going to be happening next. So I think that we can help the patients, give them some hope, and discussing why we're going on to the next therapy for those patients.
Mm-hmm. And yes, and I totally agree. So thank you for all you do for patients, because they need that level of support. We are building a Know Your Labs unit in HealthTree University to answer those specific questions. We also have a Know Your Therapy unit. So we want to help you, support you for your staff too, in helping patients get educated at home. So your staff isn't completely overburdened by
Right. So this is another modality that we can make sure we tell our patients about. They can go to HealthTree University. I mean, this is, again, supportive care and letting patients know what's out there. As far as like a multidisciplinary team, and just letting them know about the healthcare university. They can get a lot of questions answered.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just say that to echo points that were made both by Kathy and Eileen, that in the context of our team, what I particularly cherish in our group is the dialogue that exists with us as providers. In other words, I rely on my nursing team to be my antennae, that they've got their antennae up to know. And as we address symptoms and so forth, and you touched on it, Jen, in the sort of compressed environment that we deal, where we're expected to do more with far less. The importance of those antennae of our information that our nurses generate from our patients, particularly for symptom management, is critical. Many times patients will underplay to Jacob and I symptoms, because they want us to move forward, and they don't want to trouble us. Obviously, please always tell us, but the line of defense against that is, of course, our nursing team. So I want to emphasize that, because I think it's really very true. And we work, for example, on our protocols, our research nursing team and each provider, Eileen or I, we see the patients together. So everyone is in, as much as COVID allows, in the room together. And at the same time, there's constant communication. We encourage email communication. We have a patient gateway, and Jacob can speak more to that as well. But we encourage the ability for communication to be enhanced across all team members. And I know that's not necessarily the same model in all centers, but it's one that's very, very important in ours. And I think we've got, and Jacob has led this actually, a very important effort on our floor, for example, of team building with our infusion room nursing as well. And that's been incredibly successful. And in the context of the pandemic, the performance of Y7, in my opinion, has been outstanding, not least of which because by good fortune, about 2 years ago, we went through this very deliberate process of team building. And I think that generated such a good foundation that then when we met COVID, it performed extremely well. I think it's fair to say, and I hope, Jake, I'm not getting this wrong, we didn't have one single case, touch wood, of COVID transmission in the clinic at all, not one. And we've had an gratifyingly low incidence of COVID infection in our practice, thank goodness. Although there have been obviously some real challenges in our practices, perhaps elsewhere. But I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Jacob? I think.
Yeah, and I think that is true, Paul.
That's amazing. Well, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but we have important topics to also cover. So this question is kind of about your clinical work and your research and how one another informs each other. But I also want to involve the idea of clinical trials in your practice, because there are some facilities that host a lot more clinical trials than others. I know science, they consider it basic research, right? Which is kind of more like laboratory research. It's not really clinic involved, but there's also translational research, which is moving actual things that are closer to becoming approved or whatnot into the actual clinic. So do you want to first talk about how you balance your clinical work with your research? And then we'll jump to clinical trials. Oh,
I'll start, and then Paul can add his perspectives on this. And I think, Jennifer, your introduction today really hit the nail on the head. It's just wonderful to hear you recap the history of Dana-Farber, because honestly, the history of Dana-Farber is kind of the history of cancer in America. Sidney Farber was a true trailblazer and pioneer in that way. And I think that recognizing there are many institutions in the US and around the world that are doing similar things, there is something very unique about the culture at Dana-Farber as it relates to the interplay between clinical care and research. And Dr. Farber knew that from the very beginning. And I think it's just an acknowledgement that even in diseases like myeloma, where we've made a lot of progress, we can't accept the status quo. And in order to get beyond that, there really needs to be a rather elaborate infrastructure, and there have to be people who are working within that infrastructure, utilizing that infrastructure to move things forward, both from the standpoint of basic and translational and clinical research. And I'm going to stop there because honestly, on this call, Paul is one of the giants in research in the myeloma field and has been for 20 years. And working side by side with him, as Eileen and Kathy can attest, is really quite remarkable. Because he's been doing it for so long and nobody does it better.
Wow. Well, Jacob, that's incredibly kind. And that means an enormous amount. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to be part of a team. And I think Jacob touched on it beautifully. It is a team. And that's the essence of our research, because best care is best research and vice versa. And I think that the thing that I was so fortunate to have as a grounding was to work with an incredible man, the late great Emil Fry, Tom Fry, who was my first sort of senior leader when I arrived at Dana-Farber in 1993 as a fellow, then in 94. And Tom taught me exactly what Jacob personified, because in the lineage of Sidney Farber, Baruch Benacerraf, and all the greats at Dana-Farber who've made a huge difference. Tom Fry is arguably the father of modern chemotherapy. And to quickly jumpstart then to Ken, I joined Ken Anderson in partnership in myeloma in 1999, and Ken was absolutely seminal, as you pointed out, in basic concepts in the laboratory setting. And then what we were able to do was sort of bring from the bench to the bedside the next steps. But I really want to acknowledge Jacob, Eileen, and Kathy as reflecting what the beauty of Dana-Farber is, in my opinion. It is this strength to each piece. So Jacob provides fabulous clinical care and a bedrock of clinical leadership. Eileen does exactly the same in the space of nurse of her role as a superb nurse practitioner. And Kathy, frankly, in my view, there is no better example of the best myeloma clinical research nurse. And that's what I think is so special about Dana-Farber, is we have the highest quality in each of these key components that works together. Now, it's difficult to do this easily. It takes an enormous amount of time and coordination, but clinical research builds upon what comes from the bench to the bedside. But what's very important is to take back from the bedside to the bench. That's a tremendous bilateral piece of research that's critical. And so Jacob was so kind in what he said, but the reason that I think we've been successful as a team at Dana-Farber in this piece is because it's been from bench to bedside, but critically, bedside back. So we've been able, Jacob and I, Eileen and Kathy, to tell our research team in the laboratory setting what have been the pluses and minuses. As you may have seen, for example, in recent years, we've made great progress in terms of specific therapeutics. Some of them have been very challenging from a tolerability point of view. So it's been very important to feed back to the labs that we're looking for not just active agents, but ones that we can better manage from a tolerability point of view. And that's led to, I think, a great enhancement of what we call efficacy, because efficacy isn't just activity, it's tolerability as well. And so that interplay has been essential. And I think it's been a privilege too to work with our pharma partners, Jen. We've got great pharma partnerships, and you acknowledged many of them at the beginning who are supporting this program. And I think that partnership actually has to be really acknowledged and cherished, because I'm not sure, Jacob, I know of too many specific cancers in which such an extraordinary team of pharma partners have come together to take on the disease with us. And I think that's been one of our great strengths as well. In addition to what you represent, Jen, which is incredible patient advocacy and a recognition of how this all plays together. And then the final piece of this, in my opinion, is the strength of our regulatory partners. People don't, I think, perhaps appreciate this, but we're very fortunate in the United States to have a myeloma dedicated group at the FDA, led originally by Anne Farrell, with the mentorship of Rick Pazda, who is, in my view, extraordinary. Anne has now handed on her baton to Nicole Gormley, and they have been absolutely crucial in this partnership. It's no accident that we have 15 new drugs approved within 20 years. That's not just what we're not just us and others. That's also a fantastic FDA. So I think a long answer to the question, but as we integrate what we do, I think you can hear what we're saying. And one last point I make, but I really want to turn this over to others as well, is that in this mix, and I touched on the FDA, in this mix, our clinical research management has been absolutely vital. There's a lovely old saying that in research that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And if you don't have really good clinical research management, we've had multiple FDA audits because we've had the privilege of leading numerous protocols, but we would have failed on every single one had we not had fabulous research management. And they're not actually with us today, but I especially want to acknowledge Diane Warren, who Kathy, Eileen, Jacob, and I know very well, but Diane's worked with us since 1993, believe it or not. She still talks to us, it's fair to say. But the fact of the matter is Diane has been one example, shining example of a research manager second to none. And with her, it's this amazing research management team who are kind of the unsung heroes, because just like research nursing, they're as critical as anyone else to the success of the program. So, apologies for the long answer, Jen, but it's a long answer for a very good reason.
Right. No, that's team. Like Kathy, I'm interested to hear what you have to say, because when you are running these clinical trials, you have to do a lot more follow-up than is typical, because you're running more labs, you're doing them more frequently. The follow-up has to be there to report back to the trial. And so it's more work on your side to run these trials at your center, but it's what's helping all these drugs get approved in myeloma care too. So sorry to
Right.
interrupt.
No, no, you're not. I know, Jenny, before you had mentioned that, when you were diagnosed and you thought, well, maybe I am looking for a clinical trial. And I think what's really important is for patients to know how that the progress that we've made in multiple myeloma has come through clinical trials. So that's why it's so important for patients to be involved in clinical trials. And that is why we have all the drugs that we have. The thing is, as Dr. Richardson was saying, we do clinical trials, but there's so much goes on behind the scenes, with regulatory and, and internal review boards and, accountability. And this is, I can say as a nurse, and Eileen had done some research too, is that, it's how important diary cards are. I always say to patients, they're legal documents. We need to know if when you're taking your drug, and you need to, write down if you're having any side effects. These are all they're crucial. They're reportable. The FDA wants to see it. We want to, in this Dr. Richardson saying, we go from getting the drug and going back to saying, well, maybe this is something that causes too much nausea or GI distresses. And so it's very, very important for our end for having accountability, attributing that accountability, whether it's attributable to the drug or something else that's going on with the patient that may not have anything to do with the medication. So behind the scenes, it's very important, to talking to the patients and and getting their input. And because I always say to them, you're the ones that are taking this drug, and you need to tell me so that I can help you if you're having any type of adverse event, side effect, that we can help through supportive care. But all these medicines that we have, our conundrum in myeloma is because they've come through clinical trials. And I, as a research nurse, from the beginning and working for a long time, I'm just so honored and so proud to have been a part of these drugs, to actually see them get approved. And I can't be more proud of that.
Well, it's stunning. So thank you for your dedication to make that happen. Because what's happening at your facility is helping everybody right across the country.
Yeah.
So running these trials and getting the results back and accurate results, so we know. And what you were saying too about side effect management, like that's what the loop you were talking about, Dr. Richardson, like selinexor kind of had that, where they had a lot of side effects, and well, you guys learned in the clinic to reduce dose and other management strategies, and now people are able to use it well. So that continual feedback loop is really important. Eileen, did you have anything you wanted to share about the research side?
Well, I think I had a patient the other day who is an elderly woman with myeloma, and she's recently progressed. And the decision was, what do we do next with her? What's the next best treatment for her? And it turns out we have a clinical trial that she would be eligible for. And we discussed this with her. And I often get asked by patients, if this was your mother, what would you do? And, I told her that if she were my mother, I would have her go on this clinical trial. And again, that's something that, I don't know if that's the right thing to do or not, but people ask us in that manner what we would do. And, I think often, as Paul had said earlier, that, if the clinical trial fits the patient and if it works, it's fine, but we always have a backup that we can go to in standard of care that we could use. And I think it's important that people understand that. Again, Dana-Farber is a research institute, so we do encourage clinical trial participation with our patients if it's the right fit, and if patient is eligible for a trial. One of the hardest things that we ever have to do is when a patient screens for a trial and they're not eligible for whatever reason. It's really a difficult conversation, and Paul can attest to that. But it's such an important piece and part of this big puzzle of treating myeloma.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's beautifully said, Eileen. I think very importantly, though, and Jacob touched on this so nicely before, is we have these clinical pathways that our partners, Omar Nadim, Clifton Moe, Adam Sperling, and other members of our team are very engaged in, where if for any reason a patient isn't eligible for a trial, we've got a great backup strategy that we can offer them. And obviously the other piece of this is we have patients who come from far and wide. So if the clinical trial is only available at Dana-Farber, okay, but then if they for some reason there's a safety concern and they can't participate, we can give a strategy that they can pursue with their local team member as well, i.e. their local care provider, say in New Hampshire, because it's that much easier for them to do it. But we don't sever the relationship under any circumstances. That relationship continues. And then if, for example, that patient's next line of therapy unfortunately fails them, then we're ready to help them with the next. So Jenny, I want that to be very clear to our audience, because it's not an all or nothing. It's a sort of continuum of care. And the issue is this the best choice for you at this stage in your disease and this time, or is there something else? And then can we come in at a later point to help with a better alternative for that particular scenario? Jake, I'd love you to comment more, because we do this all the time together.
Yeah, I think one point that I would make in this discussion is that we spend a lot of time thinking about what's appropriate for a patient at any sort of given point in their management, at the point at that inflection in their care where a change of treatment is necessary. And I think in those conversations, it's crucially important for us to explain what the options are to a patient, explain what clinical trials might be fitting at that moment in time, what the alternatives are in terms of standard of care therapy, and based on that discussion with the patient and their family members, decide in that moment what's the best approach for that time. And I think because there are so many treatment options available now to patients, a patient may find that a trial is the right thing at one point in their care and perhaps not the right thing at another point. Mm-hmm. And it's our job and responsibility to ensure that they feel that the options are being presented and that they're comfortable with the approach that we're taking at any given point in time.
And with clinical trials, sometimes you can get early access. So I think a clinical trial should always be considered as one of the treatment options, or at least reviewed. No matter what stage you are. You could be newly diagnosed, you could be first relapse or subsequent relapses. And if you wait too long, you might not qualify, kind of like what Eileen was saying. So I think they should be considered at all times.
Jen, if I may, just one comment to add to that, which we're finding is increasingly important for patients to appreciate. For example, we have a number of trials in the upfront space which are very attractive and have really good science behind them, but they involve all approved drugs. Mm-hmm. Insurers are getting really tough about combinations, and unless the combinations are on the NCCN and or FDA approved, they will not allow them. It's an important message for patients to hear, because that gives us the ability, Jen, to offer combinations that would not otherwise be available, because their insurances will simply say no. And obviously in the context of our work, we always build them so that if at all possible, drug is free, and at the same time, it's not it's a continuum. So as long as they're benefiting from the therapy, the medicines are free.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's an important point.